A very good evening from Australia, where this is leg 2 of this Ashes winter. The England men's side have departed, tails somewhat between their legs, having lost the series 4-0. It's now over to Heather Knight and her side to see if they can fare any better in the women's event. Over the course of the next hour, we'll go through what we've seen in this series so far, or more significantly, what we haven't seen given the weather in Adelaide, and talk about that challenging build-up as well for England. We'll explore what makes Australia just so good, and as we head towards 10 o'clock, we'll have a look at the other major event on the horizon, England's defence of the 50-over World Cup in New Zealand in March. With me to go through it all, we've got a stellar lineup. World Cup winner in 2017, Alex Hartley, former Australia leg spinner Kristen Beams, and writer and broadcaster Melinda Farrell. Now, before we get stuck into the series, Mel, let's briefly explain how it all works, because the Women's Ashes is not quite how the men's series works, so talk us through it.
Yeah, well, it's a multi-format series, a brilliant idea that was adopted several years ago and has, I think, gone from strength to strength. So each of the matches has points. We have 3 T20 internationals and 3 ODIs, which are all worth 2 points each, and a test match, which is worth 4 points. So the 3 T20s being played first, you have the test match in the middle, and then the 3 ODIs at the end. And there has been some playing around and tweaking of the number of points awarded over the years. A test, I think the first time was worth 8 points, which meant basically you win that and essentially the series is almost gone. So there's been a little bit of tweaking, and it's probably now about right as well. So it can mean that if one side is a bit stronger in one format than another, there's just sort of so much context to all these games, and I think it's a great idea.
We like it, don't we, Alex? As a format, you played in the 2017 edition here in Australia.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's fantastic. And it's also a way of getting more Test cricket into the women's game. You know, it's the pinnacle of any young person's dream to play Test cricket. So the fact that we get to do that, you know, it started out with once every Ashes series, and now more and more countries are adapting or taking this multi-format, you know, series under their wings. So I think it's brilliant.
Now, we saw the series moving around before it even got underway. It was initially meant to be the test match first, and then followed by the white ball cricket. Kristen, last minute, as has been the way with a lot of things in sport over the last couple of years, it shifted with the T20s being at the start. In theory, that should have worked in England's favour, but they lost the first game by 9 wickets, and then the next 2, the rain fell in Adelaide. That is not what England needed, because T20s was their area of opportunity.
You couldn't believe it, could you? And the T20, I think it brings those teams closer together in that T20 format. But it's a real shame that the test wasn't first, because I think when we're talking about a test match and getting a result, having it up front when there's 0 points either side actually allows both teams to say, yeah, I'm going to take this on and I'm going to get a real leg up in the series. So I think the way forward is to have the test match at the start, but it did feel like England's opportunity once the T20s went. But the weather takes hold, and unfortunately for England, it's already got a bit of work to do.
That's right. And just listening to Heather Knight sort of speaking during this series, that test match is such a huge focus, and she was sort of talking about the approach to it and having to look at it now, knowing that they really have to win. But I found that a bit intriguing, because I would have thought that you almost have to do that anyway. But maybe, as Christian said, it's that idea that it's not first this time, so it's not a clean slate. So I think we might see a sort of test match where they really are both pushing for a win. And it's hard because it's 4 days and there's a little bit of, I hate to say it, rain forecast in Canberra. So big picture, it should be a no-brainer that they should be 5-day tests in a series like this. It just shouldn't even be a question anymore. But she's talked about needing to earn the right to be aggressive in a test match, which I think is very much the case. The last few test matches have been played on some pretty dreary pitches as well, which hasn't really helped any of the women's tests that we've seen played, whether they're used pitches or just not the right kind of pitches that help women's test cricket. But yeah, I think it's going to be a really fascinating contest. I'd have liked to see it played first as well, but just hoping that England don't get sort of spooked them by the whole situation as it has been, knowing that they've had matches rained off already and that there is weather about, like just how to go about putting themselves into a situation where they can actually aggressively push for the win, because they need one. That's going to be the key to them having any success in this series.
Alex, you were very excited to tell me a stat early on in this series when Australia won the first match, which was if Australia win another and the test match is drawn, which is typically what happens, they'd only need to win one more of the remaining 3 games to retain the Ashes. So England, having lost that first T20, we haven't got a huge sample size of cricket so far in this tour, but having lost that game, it puts them massively on the back foot.
It does. If this test match is a draw, the next 4 days ends up being a draw, England can still win the Ashes, but they've got to win every single ODI. Now, if we're looking at Australia's form, they've lost 1 ODI in the last 30-odd games or something ridiculous. They had a massive winning streak. Beamsy, I can't remember what the winning streak actually was, but it was like 24.
Yeah, I think it was 24.
It was at least 24, yeah.
I think it was 26 in the end. It was 24 when they broke the record, I think.
So you're looking at that. The way in for England was through these T20s, really, and then to try and get a win within the test match. But, if the test match is a draw, England can still win the Ashes. It's just highly unlikely.
And that is why that first T20 was so important. It was all going really well for England, Kristen, because they batted first. They were asked to bat. 169 for 4 looked a really good total. And then Australia chased it down in 17 overs.
Oh, they would have gone into the break thinking, actually, this is a really good total. But it's always the case. Both teams bat on the surface and then you say, OK, they were probably 20, 25 runs short. And there was just some little pockets within that innings where you think, wow, they really could have really elevated and made that a really tricky total. And for Australia, they actually just went about it how they wanted to. And watching a player like Tahlia McGrath, we talk so much about these big name Australian players, but to watch someone like a Tahlia McGrath come out and just play the way she did, I hate to say it, but Meg Lanning was second fiddle, and her innings is not that memorable, and she still ended up with a really good total.
Yeah, and cruelly robbed Tahlia McGrath of a century, I might add, by scoring too many runs at the end. Outrageous.
But this is very much the theme, though, isn't it? Australia, every time you look somewhere, Alex, there's a superstar player appearing.
Yeah, and you've got to put that down to the domestic structure that they've got. They've been professional for a number of years now. England are playing catch-up. We've only been professional for 18 months in England. We've had our first full professional season last season, and only 5 players in each regional team were professional. So we are still playing catch-up, and Australia are producing, the bowling cartel, as we keep hearing them being called. They're producing unbelievable cricketers. If we're looking at England's A squad, there's some good cricketers in there. We're just still quite raw.
Let's hear from the England camp then. I spoke to the captain, Heather Knight, and I will preface this interview by saying that we were standing underneath a gazebo with the rain falling heavily at the Adelaide Oval. So occasionally you will hear the rain on the roof of the gazebo, just as a little bit of an accompaniment to the interview. But I caught up with her after the second of the 2 washed-out games over the course of the weekend to get her reaction.
Yeah, really frustrating, isn't it? Obviously, we had that first game, did first half of it really well, second half not so good. And then obviously these 2 games have been complete washout. So it's really frustrating, but to be honest, there's not a huge amount we can do about it. We're just going to have to prepare as best we can for the test match coming up.
Are you starting to think that the weather gods of Australia, given the World T20 semi-final last year, are not necessarily on your side?
Yeah, they don't like us much here, do they? The amount of times as well that I've heard you brought the weather with you, you feel at home, it's starting to get a little bit frustrating. But it's obviously not, as I get dripped on, there's obviously not a huge amount that we can do about it. It hasn't been a great experience. I think I've had more games in my career rained off in Australia than I've ever had in England.
When you looked at the rearranged format with the T20s first, did that feel perhaps like a route into the series, given the somewhat unpredictable nature of T20 cricket?
Yeah, a little bit. I think T20 is probably one of our strongest suits. Put us in the game a little bit more, but obviously we've lost those now, so we're going to focus on that test. I think we've had some really good preparation in the last couple of years with test match cricket. That test we had against India was really good in prepping us for what we've got to come next week. So it's a pretty quick turnaround. Having 2 days to prepare for a test match when you're used to playing white ball cricket is going to be quite tricky, but I think mentally is probably going to be where we're going to have to get things right, make sure we're preparing for how we want to play things, how we want to go about batting and bowling in red ball cricket, and fingers crossed the rain will stay away.
There's not a huge sample size in terms of what cricket that we've seen, but what did you learn from that first T20?
Well, I think we're probably a little bit under par. I think bowling's actually been our real strength for the last couple of years, and the bowlers were a little bit off their execution to the standards they usually set themselves. So I think they were pretty frustrated with it, and pretty disappointed. But I think the way we took the game to Australia and with the bat, we felt like we were probably about par. And definitely in the game. So I was really impressed with Danny and Tammy, how they took the game on after actually being really scratchy. Those two didn't score a run in the warm-ups and looked pretty scratchy. So to show that character and come out and take the Aussies on was exactly what we wanted, what we've talked about as a side. And unfortunately, we were a little bit off with the ball, gave them a little bit too much width, I guess understandably, but we don't want to make excuses obviously for the build-up. And we felt like we were going to be back to our best come that second game. And really go back at the Aussies, but unfortunately we didn't get the chance to do that.
One of the things that really stood out to me ahead of this series was your comment about wanting to almost throw that first punch, be really on the front foot. What do you mean by that? What has perhaps not been the case previously that you want to see different now?
We want to take the game on. I think previously when we haven't been at our best, we've maybe gone in our shells a little bit, been a little bit tentative, and we've talked about the way to beat the Aussies is to be aggressive, to go at them in our own way, of course. We're not suddenly going to get Amy Jones sledging behind the stumps, that sort of thing, but to be aggressive in how we play the game, stick to our strengths and really try to be attacking. And they're obviously a very good side, and we feel like that was the best way to beat them. Obviously the test match coming up, things might look a little bit different. Punching first is slightly different in red ball cricket. It's about winning that first hour, and if we've got the ball in hand, trying to take wickets, and if we're with the bat, trying to make sure we're building partnerships, reading the conditions and punching first in that way.
A lot of talk about the conditions for players coming over to Australia, be it the men's side, the women's side. How are things for you guys?
Yeah, I think once we got to Adelaide, it's been really good actually. The girls have settled down really nicely. I feel like we've got real clarity on what the restrictions are, what we're allowed to do, and leading up to that first game, the vibe in the camp was really good. So it's been actually so nice to just focus on cricket, although obviously with the weather that's been another distraction. But yeah, we feel like we're into the series now and we're completely focused on the games.
Well, that was Heather Knight speaking to me on Sunday after that very frustrating day where the rain just would not relent. And that saw the series at Australia 4, England 2, and leaves us with this fascinating position, Mel, ahead of the Test match, where England, they have absolutely no option but to go for it.
They really do. And I mean, the thing with Heather Knight, having heard her speak after the second washout as well, I've come to this default emotional setting of wanting to hug visiting England captains over the Ashes summer, because just I felt so sorry for all the stuff that Joe Root's gone through. And now Heather Knight at one point was being asked about, what they could do, anything that could happen. And she was saying she might go down to some food banks because maybe they had some bad karma with the way things like the weather have gone against them. But yeah, they do now. They have to put it behind them, and they can't have any fear of the Australians. They can't go into it like that, knowing what's happened. And look, there are some injuries to the Australian side, although the ones who come back through. We're not sure totally as to how Beth Mooney is after fracturing her jaw, although it only took her a few days to be back in the nets, which is astonishing. Taylor Vlamink, the speedster, well, she's gone down with a stress fracture in her foot that's going to keep her out of the World Cup as well. But the problem is that Australia keep bringing them back. And an interesting one is Elise Perry, because she was dropped from the T20 side. For the first time in, more than a decade, probably, that Elise Perry hasn't been one of the first names on the team sheet. But Test cricket is her format, really. She has owned the format, not that it gets played very often, but when she has, the way that she's scored runs in particular and contributed with the ball has been huge. It's going to be interesting to see how she comes out of this period of being dropped back into the Australian Test side, which we assume she will be. So that's going to be quite a key, I think, in being able to get a leg up on Australia, I suppose. But we just haven't seen enough. They both played a series against India last year, and I thought they were quite similar series at a competitive level. It was a really good competition, and I wondered if that was a really good gauge. So I'm interested to see how someone like Sophie Ecclestone comes out and bowls in a Test match in a type of format that I think we can see the best of hers. And even, obviously you've got your experienced players in there like your Tammy Beaumonts, but I was really impressed by Sophia Dunkley. And maybe someone like Dunkley is a great example of a player who might not have that big fear factor of Australia that sometimes gets into the subconscious of players.
See, this is something that really interests me, Kristen, because it always feels to me that you could have identical bowling coming towards an England batter, but if they're wearing yellow as opposed to maroon or blue or whatever else...
Well, they're wearing green at the minute, so it shouldn't be a problem.
Well, you're right. They're wearing green in the T20s, but it's almost as if, because it's an Australian, England sort of panic. And was there that sense when you were part of this Australian side that when you play against England, we know that we've got a little bit of swagger about us, and there is a sense that they are the slightly sort of nervous younger sibling?
Oh, it's an interesting one. I think there is something about playing for Australia that I always used to say it was a bit like being Clark Kent and Superman, that you sort of go into the phone box and you come out and you put this uniform on and you're like, wow, I can do anything. And I definitely had that feeling as a player, because it felt like when you went to training for Australia in the lead up to a selection of a game or a series, that was actually much harder than actually playing. So I think as an Australian player, you're sort of like, well, now I just actually get to go and show off my skills. I've actually done all of the hard work, and it's nearly like they hunt in a pack. You know, you sort of feel like you are just a small part of this big sort of thing. And so I think for Australia, they've always had that confidence, and not to the point of an arrogance, but one of the things that I really loved going head to head with England when you had a player like Sarah Taylor, because for me she had this amazing, like, I thought she had a great ego health. I thought she just had a wonderful confidence. She used to go after us, and we used to see different, and I think that's what we want to see. And so I think at times I'd like to see England actually puff their chest out a little bit more and say, like, I'm coming after you, because I think when we've had those really good battles, we've seen players do that consistently. So I don't think it's necessarily a skill thing as much as it is a confidence thing.
Well, we heard from Heather Knight just a moment ago saying that you're never going to get Amy Jones behind the stumps giving sort of all sorts of sledging. But there is a bit of a sense, Alex, that maybe England could just be a little bit more broader shoulder and march out there with a bit more something.
Yeah, they're a nice group, the England girls. That's how you would describe them, a nice group of girls. Yes, they're competitive. Yes, they want to win. But we always look at Australia and be like, oh, they are so arrogant, so cocky. Like,
and it's not true.
They're so good at cricket. And it is so true. No. But then they win games of cricket. They've earned the right to have that confidence and to have that. I think it's always good if you look at somebody like Kevin Peterson, Tammy Beaumont, they've got that certain arrogance about them that make them a good cricketer. You know, Nat Siver, the world's best all-rounder, isn't arrogant in the slightest. Amy Jones, the best keeper in the world, isn't arrogant in the slightest. They're a nice group of people.
Is that to their detriment? Would they be better if they were?
No, because it's not their personality types. I think everybody works different. You know, Sophie Eccleston, she likes to get in the battle, and when she's fired up and she's angry, she bowls unbelievably well. Heather Knight, she's calm, cool, collected, but she's got that certain, I'm going to take it to Australia, I'm going to dig in here and do my best. And I just think they're all individuals who have to come together to play this game of cricket, and they've all got different personality types.
It's interesting, Mel, because hearing the player's perspective from Alex and Kristen, you do get a bit of a sense of how it might be from the inside. But looking on, from a journalistic point of view, you see it as well, just in that sense that Australia walk out, they look always like winners every time they go on the field.
Winning breeds confidence, though, obviously, doesn't it? A lot of it for Australia, too, stems back to the 2017 World Cup when they were bundled out, as the old cliche goes, by India, and a terrific innings by Harmanpreet Kaur.
It was a dark day.
Well, it was. It really was.
Day.
If you talk to anyone in the Australian camp, they will go back to that day. They've talked about it as the nadir, and they all went away from that at that point because they kind of lost that a bit, or sort of felt like maybe there was some complacency had set in, I think, at that point, and maybe it was a little bit cozy in selections as well. There was a really sort of standard group there for a lot of the time, and maybe not as much pressure coming sort of from the domestic level. They talk about that loss, that crushing loss, more so than when they were beaten in the T20 World Cup final in 2016. It was that 2017 loss, and they went away from that. And they have done a hell of a lot of work since then on just deciding what their core values were, and everyone in the squad being accountable, particularly for every single thing that they do. So it's not always there. It's not always infallible, I think, is that, okay, it's just because you're Australian, because they've been in that place where that kind of crumbled. And so, we see teams do this, the cycles and coming through. And Australia and England have often gone one and the other. When you talk about professionalism of the game, one country does this and then the other looks at them and goes, oh, hang on, we better catch up here. And that goes backwards and forwards. But the thing is, with Australian cricket, they've gone so far forwards now that it is becoming harder to catch up.
Yeah, it feels that way, Kristen. And you would have seen post-2017 how the side responded and how they have just leapt forward. It is a different stratosphere.
Yeah, it feels like there was two parts to that. I think there was one part about being really clear on the direction of that Australian team. So there's been a big push about fast bowlers, and I think that happened after 2017. Matthew Mott was very clear on saying, I want girls that can bowl fast, and they were willing to promote them within that Australian setup. I think the other thing that he wanted to see within that team was all-rounders, and we see a team now flooded with all-rounders, so it means that he's got really good options. So there were a lot of players at that time that only did one skill set and found themselves, myself included, that were moved on at that time, and I think that was a really clever way of setting up for the future.
And we have to remember as well, England are the second best team in the world. 50 over champions. I know it was 4 years ago now, 5 years ago nearly, but they are the second best team in the world. So we're talking like England are rubbish at cricket, but they're not. They're just being, well, we've seen one game of cricket, which is unfortunate, but they've just been outplayed in one section of a cricket game, and therefore we obviously have to analyse it. And England have the opportunity to bounce back and show how much they've improved since the 2019 Ashes, because Australia wiped the floor. England won one game in that whole Ashes series, 7 matches. They won the last T20. It could have been a complete whitewash. So they've had to regroup. They've had to look at where they can get better. And ultimately, it does come from domestic cricket, and we've set up the domestic competition now. It's just raw. It's just really early on.
What were the realistic expectations, Alex, for England in this series? Because they'll always say we believe we can win, and you'd hope that they would, because if you don't believe you can win, what's the point? But realistically, deep down, what were the expectations?
To be better than last time. I think to put certain areas where they were outplayed last time right, and can they get a couple of wins in the ODI series? Can they one win in the ODI series? Can they get a couple of wins in the T20? Can they put up a better fight in the Test match? Realistically, weren't going to win this Ashes series, but can they be better than they were in 2019?
Is that a fair assessment? Is that how the Australian side looks at it?
Yeah, I think they would have looked at it and said, we want to win every game in this series and take that momentum into a 50-over World Cup. I don't think they would have had any less expectations than winning every single game. And I think they would have talked about that based on their form, based on the players coming in. Even though there's been some injuries around, they've been able to pick the best of the best. And we're talking about an Australia A team that's going really well. And we're all of a sudden players like Georgia Redmayne, Elise Villani, they can't get a game. They would play in any other country's team around the world. So they are flooded with really good talent at the moment, coming off really good form. So, I think they would just have expected to win everything.
Yeah, Alex and I got on some of those higher electric scooters, Mel, and made a journey across Adelaide to watch the A game the other day, and it was a chastening afternoon. England lost by 10 wickets. There was a gulf in that game as well.
Yeah, there was. It was quite hard to watch. England put on a decent score. I think they got 150, and Australia just chased it down with 3 overs to spare. It was very similar to the game we saw the day before.
And this is the theme that we have to accept is the sort of way it is at the moment. And sometimes it's okay, Mel. And England have lost one game. Let's not forget this. They could still win this Ashes series. But if you look at the broader picture, it's okay that England aren't as good as Australia, but they have to see improvement.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been writing about this for years, about the fear of the gap widening just because Australia has put so much investment into women's cricket. And that there is World Cup tournaments, look, anyone can have an off day, it can happen. So it's not a foregone conclusion that Australia will win the next World Cup, but they are massively, they're the unbackable favourites, basically. And you do, with it, I mean, just even hearing someone say, they expect to win every game as a bare minimum, that is a hugely strong statement. Other countries do have to look at how they invest in the domestic structure. Australia made that decision sort of 7 or 8 years back, where instead of just going for big central contracts for the team, which is the model that the ECB took, they gave them central contracts, but then also set aside some money for the domestic structure underneath. And it was small. It was maybe like about, for the one-dayers, it was maybe about $5,000. And I think it was a few $1,000s for WBBL. But it grew each time that the pay sort of went up. And so all of a sudden, then you've got like 120 players that aren't necessarily fully professional, but they're earning almost a professional, if not a professional wage. So that's the investment. That's planting the seed several years ago that we're now seeing bear fruit. And every other country around the world is looking at Australia and going, how do we do that? When it comes to tournaments like a World Cup in particular, but even, in an Ashes series, there are still teams that can, informed teams that cannot go well. I think the challenge for England is going to be, after batting so well and walking off halfway through that first T20 and going, we're firm favourites to win this. we've done really well here. The fact Australia got there 1 wicket down with 3 overs to spare at a canter, that would have to be more crushing than a close loss, because you just have to be going, well, what do we do here?
But Kristen, is it more crushing than a loss where you play really badly? Because actually, if you play really well and lose like that, you'll suddenly think, well, what more could we do?
Yeah, we've heard a little bit about saying, well, and Australia might have been a little bit off in parts as well. So there's nearly like saying, well, we expect them to probably be better. But yeah, it's frustrating when you feel like you've done half of a game really well. And so you find yourself going, well, hang on, am I going to be really negative about this, or am I going to be really positive that we had a really good first half? And I think the key in a series like this is for England to say there's actually lots of really good things. I think Australia were going to look at changing their team, and will continue to look at changing their team based on the way that Danny Wyatt went after the bowlers in the power play. So it's really important that when you look at all of those things, you go, where are the moments where we actually made it really difficult, and you need to go in really hard. And I think England having really good diverse options from a bowling point of view is really how they can try and expose Australia. So I think having the left arm of Farron, I would have loved to have seen her play in these T20s for that reason. I like Charlie Dean coming in. I think we want to see people spinning the ball. That is going to ask more questions of Australia, because I kind of agree with Alex. There's actually still plenty in this series, even though it's easy to sit here and go, oh yeah, Australia going to roll through it. I think England can start to really push Australia if they're willing to just take a punt.
Well, let's have a little bit more of a closer look at this test match then. They are rare things, women's test matches. For half a decade only England and Australia played them, and that was only every couple of years when there was an Ashes series, so they are not common, and often we see draws. In fact, every single women's test match since 2014, Mel, has been a draw.
Yeah, I've had a funny feeling that maybe we might see a result. I was at the last one that wasn't a draw. It was at the WACA, and a big key for that was that it was a great wicket. Great pitch, I should say. I've been in Australia for too long. I should be saying great pitch, just not a wicket. But it was the best one I've ever seen for a women's test, and it was the best test one of the best tests I've ever seen of any kind, but certainly women's test. And because it was a pitch that did a lot, it allowed everyone to showcase, whether it was the batters, the spinners, the quicks. So it had something for all of them. And that is a key as well, because we have seen these draws played on used pitches, dead pitches as well, and it does no favours. And the other factor that comes into it is, even though they do have some experience, it's still a really small sample size. The most experienced players have still only played, a handful of test matches in their whole career. So sometimes we see tactically it becomes a real challenge because of not knowing when to take the game on, and when you've got to sort of ride the rhythms of Test cricket. And Test cricket is so much about the rhythms of the new ball, the time of day, how many overs have been bowled at that point by which bowlers. So there's all those factors. And people always have to remember, I think, when it comes to women's Test cricket, so they don't play any multi-day domestic cricket. So it's a completely new format. And it's a red ball. They hardly ever bowl with a red ball or bat against a red ball. So even for those who have some experience, I think it's still a massive challenge for them to be able to pin everything on the tactics of the game, because we've seen that happen a lot of times where they do go for the wrong tactics. It ends up being really defensive, and then because of the points offered, we've often seen test matches where they've been unwilling to push for the result because actually the draw is going to help them win the series.
If you look at the comparison between, say, Stuart Broad and Elise Perry, they've been playing international cricket for around about the same amount of time. Elise Perry has played 9 test matches. Stuart Broad is north of 150. That tells a bit of a story, doesn't it?
It does, but 9's a lot in the women's game as well. So everyone looks at Elise Perry and goes, gosh, she played a lot of test match cricket, hasn't she? But she hasn't. You know, Stuart Broad, 150 plus test matches, whereas Elise Perry, 9. I mean, that tells its own story. Every time you pull on your whites, representing your country in women's cricket, you're learning on the job. And I think that tells something. Every time Heather Knight is captain, she hasn't played test match cricket for so long, she has to remember how to captain again, remember how to go about certain tactics. And England women said it during the test match against India, we're learning as we're going. You know, Sophie Ecclestone bowled 60-odd overs. I don't think we'll see that from her this time round because it was far too many and they learned on the job that it was too much for her.
So that's something I think that people underestimate. So having spoken to a lot of former test players recently around the men's Ashes, and some of the players as well in the Ashes series, the men tell you that they're still learning on the job when they're playing test cricket. And I don't think us common folk really always comprehend just how much learning is done on the job. Now, if those guys who've been playing so many matches are still learning about different pitches and what lengths to bowl and, you know, working on what batting stance they should take or all that sort of thing. They're still learning. How much more difficult is it for the women who get to maybe play one test if they're lucky, or if they've played 3 or 4, they're considered highly experienced?
Well, you, Kristen, played 1, so you have that rare thing of a test cap, but only the one game. I mean, how did you approach it? How did you possibly go out there and try and give your best, having never played the format?
It's such a hard thing because as a player, you just didn't want to be a one-hit wonder. So every goal as a female test cricketer is to try and play 2, and I didn't. I only played 1. And it was a very short lead up. It was basically a week of training with a red ball, talking about it, getting different people in to have conversation. And I think for me personally, I knew I was probably going to get the opportunity to play test cricket because I was a leg spinner and I was the only leg spinner within the squad at that time. So it was like, I think they're going to want to play me in that. But we didn't really have a lot in terms of practice games. I think we played a 3-day game maybe against England Academy, and that was all we really had. So there's a big question mark for me on how we do go about the preparation. There's been talks about it here in Australia about should we be considering playing some 2 or 3-day matches domestically to try and elevate Test cricket. I think it comes down to the ICC have to lead from the front. They have to commit to playing more Test cricket, and I think if they can do that, then Cricket Australia, the ECB, will be forced into saying we have to find out how do we prepare. We're not going to see 4-day cricket added to domestic schedules. I think that we're all put our hands up and say, yeah, budget-wise, that's probably never going to happen. It's a big commitment, but we might see some additional games. We might see more England A, Australia A games that are being played just to try and upskill players because we want the same thing. We want our young players who are in their early 20s to be confident that they know how to win a test match.
And I know, Alex, from speaking to you previously, that it's one of your great regrets from an England career that saw you win a World Cup, that you got so close to playing an Ashes Test match but didn't quite get picked in the end.
Yeah, I was in the squad. I actually knew I wasn't going to play when we played a warm-up game against Australia A, and I was the only person in the squad not to get on the field for the warm-up game. Everyone else bowled, everyone else batted, and I carried the drinks. I thought, well, that's my test career over. And then in 2019, when Australia came over, I wasn't even in the squad, so I was just a net bowler, which was even worse because you don't get picked in the squad, but yet you're good enough to bowl at our girls, but not against Australia.
But why does it matter?
I just think it's just a dream. When you start growing up watching cricket, you watch men's test cricket, the test matches are such a rarity. To say that you've got a test cap, to say you've got an ODI cap or a T20 cap, it's special. But to say you're one of an elite number that has a test cap, I'll never be part of that, and it really upsets me to this day.
Mel, I think what it comes down to, a lot of the time you hear cricketers asked what is the pinnacle of the game in the men's game, and without wishing to compare men's and women's cricket too much, but often the answer is Test cricket is the pinnacle of the game. And if the governing bodies around the world view Test cricket as the pinnacle of the game and women only play it once in a blue moon, then it's some sort of level, there's an imbalance.
Of course there is. You look at someone like Susie Bates, who's been one of the most outstanding female cricketers of the past decade or so, has never played a test match. There are so many fantastic female players who have been at the top who've never got to play one. And that's, I think, incredibly sad that for the game. And I do think even within Cricket Australia, I know that it was actually the ECB that pushed this multi-format series forward, and they wanted a test match. And actually the resistance came from Cricket Australia, because they, at the time, really just were looking at T20 as the way forward, the most commercially viable, broadcast-friendly format of the game, and they weren't really interested. So I think that someone like Claire Connor and the ECB actually deserves a lot of credit for at least pushing it. And now that the multi-format series has been a success, I think there's more support for it now within Cricket Australia to at least, have that series against India last time, which was pretty exciting as well, to see another test match being played. So I think that the multi-format series has made them see, okay, there is some interest here. And I don't know how much that will come from the ICC, because I think they still see T20 as very much the format for expanding and encouraging women's cricket, and I can understand why in other countries as well, that's sort of coming through. But I just hope, I'd love to see this multi-format series take off more. Women's cricket's actually been great at getting some really good structures together. So, for example, the one day, the way that they do ODI cricket, and they have the Women's Championship that leads up, and every country has to play every other country. 3 ODIs are set aside, and they get points for that, and all of that determines World Cup qualification. And that was actually kind of a really good thing, because whereas men's cricket, and you're right, you don't want to compare it all the time, but whereas they have so many bilateral ODI series that have really limited interest and almost no context, so you have in the past, it's sort of starting to change now with different formats in the men's game. But with women's cricket, you had some really great context in ODIs. So when you've got all the teams that have to play each other anyway, they've got to play each other with 3 ODIs, the idea of adding a test match onto that, and there'll usually be a couple of T20s as well, and turning it into a multi-format series probably means adding, say, 9 days, which is a cost to any tour. But I think what it could do for the skill, for the interest in Test cricket, and the players' keenness to sort of play that multi-day format and learn a lot more as well, I think would be huge. I'd love to see it happen. I'm just not sure. It's changed a bit in Australia, and they've really softened towards it. England have always been really keen to do more of it. Players in other countries are very keen. I'm just not sure how much support there is for it from a governing body perspective.
I was going to say, if you ask every single player around the world if they want to play Test cricket, not one of them will say no. Yeah. Every single one of them will say yes. Right through from England, Australia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, South Africa. Everyone wants to play Test cricket.
Well, that says its own story, doesn't it? And you'll be able to hear all of the Test match from Monaco Oval tomorrow evening. Our coverage on 5 Live Sports Extra and on BBC Sounds. We know what England have got to do in that Test match. They've got to be aggressive. Let's hear from their head coach, Lisa Keightley. I spoke to her in Adelaide, and she talked about how England had to approach the game in a positive fashion.
Yeah, definitely. We need to definitely set up the first innings to give us a chance with bat and ball, and hopefully get that opportunity where we can put some pressure on and get some points.
Does it frustrate you the way the series works like that, i.e. a draw for the side that holds the trophy gives them that slight advantage and maybe creates defensive cricket?
No, I don't think so. I think I like it, a bit like the men's. If you have it, it should be harder to get. Test match being 5 days might give us a better chance, and I think, look, moving forward there's talk of that happening down the track. So if that's the case, and you can have 5 days to really try and win a test match, and if you've got to draw it, you've got to really work hard to even do that. Where I think with the 4 days to draw is quite easy. You've got to have everything go well for you if you're trying to win it.
And this seems to be a theme, doesn't it? It's very rare you get a result in a women's test match. It's also a challenge for the players who are sort of finding their way a bit with these games because they play so little red ball cricket. What have you been doing with Heather and the team to try and give them a little bit of an edge in understanding the nuance of 4-day cricket?
Well, for us, playing the test match against India was a fantastic opportunity to grow and help support in the way we want to play and for them to understand their game and how to go about it. So that was really good in the summer. So I feel like they're not that far away and they have it in their minds and skill set of what they've got to do. They've just got to go out and actually do it in the game.
How confident are you that England can reclaim the Ashes?
It's tough. Now that we lost the first game and we've had 2 washouts, the test match is really important, isn't it? If we can win that test match, we'll come out in front and then we've got a chance. If we draw, it's really tough. But we've got to set it up before we can win it, don't we? So it'll be play the first session with bat and ball really well and we'll can work out what we can do from there.
Well, that was Lisa Keightley speaking to me in the rain at Adelaide after that second washed-out T20 match at the weekend. Now, this Ashes series, Kristen, we know that it is in some ways just the prelude to what is potentially the main event of the winter for the women's game, and that is the 50-over World Cup that takes place in New Zealand. Is the Ashes a little bit undermined by that on the horizon, do you think?
Not by the players. I think that for every player from both England and Australia, you measure yourself on an Ashes series, and to Alex's point, it's the pinnacle. You give up all of your other games just to play a test match. So I think for both teams, it'll be like, this is actually really important. And then I think it really does become a secondary. And I'll be really intrigued to see how this series goes and what that means for selection for both of these teams. Will we see players pulled in from England A, Australia A in terms of the one-day team? I think you could make a name for yourself during this series and carry it forward, or you could nearly have some poor form and find yourself out of it. So I think it just puts a little bit more pressure on players to make sure they're at the top of their game consistently across this series so they can take the momentum in. So I think there's a bit of intrigue and potentially some drama with injuries and the like. So it'll be, fascinating to see how both teams and squads get selected.
Alex, it's bad news in the sense that your time as being a World Cup title holder is approaching its conclusion.
Honestly, the best thing to come out was that I got it for an extra year.
Yes, because they delayed this tournament for a year.
So I reckon I've been a World Cup holder longer than anyone else has, which is fantastic, because all those girls that had the World Cup that are still playing for England, they might lose it. Well, I won't. I'm done. I'm gone. I've had it for 5 years.
Your positivity shines through, Alex. It's in New Zealand. It starts in March, Mel, and it's been a long time coming, 5 years coming, in fact, and we expected it to be in 2021. It's been pushed back to 2022. There's still quite a lot of stress, worry and drama around it because New Zealand is one of the last forts, if you like, in the COVID world where getting in is an absolute nightmare.
It is, and that's why they had to change this Ashes series around, because it was actually too tight, because you're essentially told what date you have to get in to the country, and you've got to do a hard quarantine of 10 days. There's no way around it. And you have to get exemptions as well to get in. So they've basically got to leave the day after the final ODI is played. So that's what's necessitated a change around here. And that it makes it really hard as a lead-in for that tournament. It's going to affect it in other ways, I think, too, as New Zealand goes into, I think, a code red now for COVID, which means more mask wearing, and I don't know if they'll bring in some more crowd restrictions or things like that around the actual matches. It's massively going to affect the amount of journalists and media who go into New Zealand, which doesn't seem like a big deal to most people, but believe me, women's cricket is one where you rely on the goodwill of journalists to try and drum up coverage and interest as well, because a lot of major organisations don't invest in sending people. So I think all of that it's going to be a bit difficult for the ICC compared to the last one that was in Australia. That, you know, we saw 86,000 people at the MCG for the final, and we saw good crowds at other grounds as well. So it means that there won't be as many travelling fans from countries like Australia to go and support, and that's, I think, going to be disappointing. And I hope they're still able to put on a really good show. I just think it's possibly going to feel a little bit more low-key, even than the last one in England, which 2017 was brilliant. There were some terrific crowds for that. I remember that. Packed Lords was one of the best days at Lords that I've ever experienced for that final between England and India. So I hope it doesn't, and I hope they're able to support it as well as they possibly can. But the restrictions and quarantines, I think, are going to take an effect, as they have on so many cricket matches and tournaments and series in the past couple of years.
Kristen, we know that the players have got this tough, hard quarantine. Everyone has going into New Zealand. We also expect, and the latest that I've heard is that players won't be able to have partners with them as well. And so you're asking a huge amount of people that have been in a lot of bubbles to go into a 6-week-long tournament with no loved ones, hard quarantine. This is a massive ask, isn't it?
It really is, and it is off the back of this series as well. So whilst there's a little bit of freedom for players here, it's still a long time away, especially for the England girls, in terms of getting here, then having this series, and then going straight into the next one. We've seen in Australia some states have had harder lockdowns, and especially in New South Wales and Victoria, where there's quite a number of the girls, so they've had different restrictions and they've been stuck a little bit. We're also talking about, well, particularly from an Australian point of view, we're talking about people who are mums for the first time and not only have partners but kids. There's so many other factors that maybe we've not had before, and I think the impact of that will be seen in some way. I think we are more likely to see players say, I'm actually not sure I can do it for this length of time, and that has to be respected, and it's got nothing to do with want in terms of wanting to be a part of this series and the World Cup, but it is a really big ask for players, and I've got no doubt that every country, and especially England and Australia, will be doing everything they can to make this experience the best that it can be and to allow them the freedoms and balance to keep everything rolling along. But even still, it is a huge ask to be away from your family for such a long period of time.
Should the tournament be in New Zealand, Alex?
No. Straight up, no. It shouldn't. It could be anywhere around the world. Probably not in England. Might have a few rain-disturbed games. Probably not as many as you would in Australia, mind. But it could be anywhere. South Africa, Dubai. We've already seen a World Cup be moved to Dubai. Why could this one not? And I just think, if there are going to be so many problems getting into New Zealand, why on earth has this not been thought about before, and why on earth has it not been moved? It just blows my mind. It's even difficult for us to get there as broadcasters, let alone, I'm not going to take my family, I'm happy, I'm on my own, I can go travelling for as long as I want. But, you know, Lizelle Lee for South Africa, her missus is due in 6 weeks. You know, I think it's in 6 weeks. So she's not going to, is she going to want to miss the birth of her child? Is she going to want to miss the first month of her child growing up? Probably not. One of the best players in the world.
I mean, I believe that the ICC were looking at it probably maybe about sort of 6 months ago, and I think there's been this hope, hasn't there, even here in Australia, that this summer was going to be easier after what had happened before, and then Omicron came along and everything started, to become stricter and come back in after sort of a few months where it felt like the world was opening up a little bit. So maybe that feeling it was opening up a little bit more made them more hopeful about the World Cup being in New Zealand. But I mean, I agree with Alex. In the end, it's, I think, just going to just make it much more of a low-key tournament, and that's probably not what the ICC wanted.
Are you going to get the best out of your players when they've just done 10 days hard quarantine?
I said this but I've been saying this all summer about, I think we're going to look back on this period when we're looking at men's cricket, women's cricket. I don't think we fully comprehend just how much of a toll the way that the world has been with the bubbles and the biosecurity thing and the constant anxiety of testing all the time and waiting for the results. just all that, which we've experienced to a smaller degree this summer. And I don't know about you, Henry, but I've been having this low-key anxiety every time I've gone for a test and I've been waiting for the result. That's just a small part of what's been going on. And I just really don't think we fully understand it yet. And I fear it's going to possibly end some cricket careers earlier than they should, because there will be people who just won't be, it'll just become too much and they won't want to do it anymore.
I also think you don't want to be the player that takes out the captain and the best player in the team. Could you imagine you've gone out for a coffee, you've picked up COVID and you take out 3 or 4 of your players? Nobody wants to be that person. So everybody, and rightly so, is being more careful than they're actually having to be, because they don't want to miss out on a World Cup. And also they've said, if you get COVID 3 weeks out of this World Cup, we're not going to let you in the country at all. So in 3 weeks before they're even due to travel, they're going to be in a stricter lockdown.
I think that's exactly right. I had the opportunity the other day to catch up with my very good friend Meg Lanning, and I was just so nervous about catching up with her for a coffee. And then we worked out we couldn't have coffee. We had to go for a walk with our masks on and be socially distanced. And in the end, I got so nervous about it. I said, can we just do a FaceTime date? And we both sat in our hotel rooms, maybe a kilometre apart, and spoke to each other over FaceTime, which seemed ridiculous. But that is the sort of anxiety that people are going to have as players, because you are right. You don't want to take anyone down with you. And I still go back to it. The players are the product. So we need to provide the best conditions for players to be able to perform at their best. And it is as simple as that. And I think it's difficult because I think from a public's point of view, you look at it and say, well, these girls are really lucky. They still get to travel around and they still get to do all those sorts of things. But it's you don't actually get a chance to see everything that sits behind what we look out and say, wow, like this is the game of cricket. It's going really well. Look how happy these girls are. Well, actually, there's a whole lot of things that sit behind it, and that's the challenging part.
And it's a deeper problem, isn't it? Think if we look back over the last 2 years, how many players have had breaks or spoken about mental health? And it's all come from bubble life. And you've got people around the world saying, well, why does Tom Banton not want to go and do 10 days quarantine to go and play in Pakistan? Because it's hard. It's really hard. Kate Cross has come out and said Derby in 2020 was the most horrific time of my life. It was gross. It's hard work. It's not nice. And these players are sacrificing a lot to play cricket. And yes, it is one of the best jobs in the world, but it does come with its own problems.
I was talking to Rachel Haynes about coming back from New Zealand, and of course, but then you had to do 2 weeks hard quarantine in Australia, and she was telling me that the room she got was small and really dark. I think it faced a building, so it was a really dark room. It was boiling hot. I think it was in Brisbane. It was really hot, and the air conditioning stopped working. So she's in this small dark room that was like a hot box, and she said, I'm not sure I can actually do this. She said that feeling of almost freaking out. She said, I just don't know. Am I going to be able to do this? She said, luckily they got the air conditioning on, and I sort of felt a bit okay again, but if someone is as calm and clear-headed and chilled out as Rachel Haynes was going, well, I'm not sure I can actually keep going with this. I'm only on about, day 5 or 6 and I've got another, 8-9 days left to go. Yeah, just be really difficult.
Well, the World Cup is all to come, and you'll hear it all on 5 Live and 5 Live Sports Extra. But before that, we do have the Women's Ashes to conclude a Test match and 3 one-day internationals. We stand at the moment with Australia on 4 points, England on 2. If the series is level, as it was last time in Australia, then Australia will retain the trophy. Now I'm going to ask you all to nail your colours to the mast. First of all, Kristen, how's this series going to finish? What will the score be?
I really have everything crossed that there's going to be a result in the Test match, but I'm calling that a draw. So it'll be 2 points there, and Australia won't lose any ODIs. So how many points does that give me?
So that would give 6-4 after the Test match, and then 3 more wins would take Australia 12-4.
I'm going 12-4 then.
I've said from the off 10-6. So draw in the Test match, England just get a sneaky win in the ODIs, 10-6.
I'm going with 10-6 as well, but I'm not sure how
England.
I think it's going to happen. yeah, 10. Oh, why not? My predictions never come right anyway, so why don't I just go with England to win the Test match, and then we'll see where we are. Look, they could. They really could. Australia against India didn't really nail that test match at all, and India were on top for a lot of periods of time. Australia made a lot of mistakes in that, so they're not infallible in the test match. I think it's quite a leveler, actually. So who knows, maybe a sneaky win for England there.